The first sound was the sirens, a discordant shriek tearing through the otherwise tranquil Saturday afternoon, growing louder closer with an alarming speed. Then came the thud of heavy boots on asphalt, the guttural shouts of commands, a chaos that didn't belong in our quiet, tree-lined suburban street. I was in my home office, reviewing preliminary schematics for the city's new downtown surveillance initiative, a cup of rapidly cooling coffee at my elbow, when a prickle of unease, sharp and insistent, made me look up. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I moved to the window, my heart already beginning a frantic tattoo against my ribs. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. Two black SUVs, unmarked but unmistakably law enforcement, were angled aggressively across the street, effectively blockading our cul-de-sac. Men in full tactical gear, helmets obscuring their faces, weapons drawn and leveled, were advancing on my own front lawn. And there, caught in the terrifying crosshairs of their focused intensity, was Jamal, my nephew. A 16-year-old boy, his lanky frame frozen in a mixture of terror and disbelief, his hands half raised, the small, brightly colored toy drone he'd been so excited about lying forgotten on the grass beside him. Red laser dots danced on his chest. Get down. On the ground now, hands where I can see them, the commands were brutal, amplified, leaving no room for question or hesitation. Jamal, bless his terrified heart, tried to comply his movements, jerky and uncoordinated. He started to lower himself, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. No, stop. He's a child. It's a toy. The words ripped from my throat as I threw open my front door and stumbled onto the porch, my mind struggling to process the surreal horror unfolding before me. My voice sounded thin, reedy against the backdrop of armed men and palpable threat. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am the Director of City Surveillance. I oversee the network of cameras, the data streams, the technological eyes that watch over our metropolis. I understand security protocols, threat assessment, emergency response. But what I was witnessing on my own front lawn, directed at my nephew, a boy I loved like a son, was not a measured response. It was a grotesque overreaction, a terrifying display of force. And as I caught sight of Karen Mitchell, our neighbor from 3 houses down, standing on her porch with a phone pressed to her ear, her expression a disturbing mix of fear and vindictive satisfaction, a sickening realization began to dawn. This was her doing. Jamal was here for the summer, a much-needed escape from the city bustle, where his parents, my sister, and her husband worked demanding jobs. He was a good kid, quiet, thoughtful, with a budding passion for technology and engineering. The drone had been a gift from me, a high-quality but ultimately harmless hobbyist model meant to encourage his interest to give him a project. He'd spent hours meticulously assembling it, his brow furrowed in concentration, his face lighting up with triumph when he'd finally gotten it airborne for the first time just yesterday. He'd been flying it in our spacious backyard well, within the boundaries of our property, the gentle hum of its rotors, a background note to an otherwise peaceful afternoon. Until now. Identify yourself. One of the SWAT officers barked his weapon, still trained on Jamal, though his head swiveled towards me. I'm Marcus Thorne. I live here. That's my nephew. Jamal. He's 16 years old. That's a toy drone. I shouted, my hands raised to show I was unarmed, trying to project an authority I didn't feel in the face of such overwhelming firepower. My wife, Sarah, appeared behind me, her face pale, her hand flying to her mouth in a silent scream. The officer, clearly the team leader, hesitated for a fraction of a second. My address, my name, perhaps it rang a distant bell. But the tension remained excruciatingly high. We received a report of a suspicious individual operating an unidentified aerial device, possibly weaponized, casing the neighborhood. Potential terrorist threat. A terrorist threat, I echoed, incredulous. I looked at Jamal, still prone on the grass, his body trembling. I looked at the small, innocuous drone, now looking like a broken butterfly. Then I looked back at Karen Mitchell, who was now joined by her husband, a nervous bird-like man who wrung his hands as he watched the drama unfold. Her eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of something ugly there, a defiant glint that confirmed my worst fears. This was the hook, the moment our lives were irrevocably thrown into chaos, the moment a child's innocent pastime was twisted into something monstrous by prejudice and malice. Our life in the Oak Haven subdivision, had been for the 5 years we'd lived there a comfortable, if somewhat unremarkable, middle-class existence. Sarah and I chose it for its reputed schools, its manicured lawns, and its proximity to my downtown office. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways, and children's laughter usually filled the air on weekends. We were one of a handful of black families in Oak Haven, something we were aware of, but had never felt overtly targeted by. There were the usual microaggressions, the occasional awkward comment, but nothing that prepared us for this. Jamal's arrival for the summer had brought a youthful energy to our home. He was a good influence on our two younger children, David and Maya, who adored their older cousin. He spent his days tinkering with the drone, reading sci-fi novels, and occasionally helping me with yard work, all the while dreaming of studying aerospace engineering. He was a typical teenager, sometimes moody, often glued to his phone, but fundamentally decent, respectful, and kind. The idea that anyone could perceive him, with his bright, inquisitive eyes and his slightly shy demeanor, as a terrorist threat was so ludicrous it would have been laughable had the situation not been so terrifyingly real. Karen Mitchell, however, was the neighborhood's self-appointed watch captain, a woman whose vigilance often tipped into paranoia and whose definition of suspicious seemed to have a disturbingly narrow racial lens. She was a prominent figure in the Homeowners Association, known for her meticulous enforcement of even the most arcane bylaws. We'd had a few minor run-ins with her, a notice about our trash cans being left out an hour too long, a complaint about the color Sarah had wanted to paint the front door, apparently not in the approved HOA palette. We'd navigated these with polite compliance, dismissing her as a harmless eccentric, a caricature of the overzealous HOA enforcer. We had grossly underestimated her capacity for harm. The inciting incident, the catalyst for this nightmare, was Karen's 911 call. A call in which, as I would later learn, she hadn't just reported a drone. She had specifically described a young black male acting erratically, operating a sophisticated surveillance drone, possibly modified, looking into windows, hovering over my property like he's planning something. She'd used charged language words like threatening demeanor, unresponsive to my calls to stop, and the clincher, I fear for my safety, it could be a terrorist device. She had skillfully, maliciously painted a picture designed to elicit the maximum possible response, playing on societal fears and racial biases. It took what felt like an eternity, but after a tense exchange where I reiterated my identity, my position with the city, and the complete absurdity of the situation, the SWAT team leader slowly, grudgingly began to de-escalate. They didn't lower their weapons immediately, but the aggressive posture softened slightly. He spoke into his radio, his voice low and urgent. Jamal was allowed to sit up, then slowly get to his feet, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his eyes wide with a trauma that I knew would not easily fade. The red dots vanished from his chest, but I could still see their phantom imprint. Sarah rushed to him, enveloping him in a hug, murmuring reassurances I couldn't quite hear. I, however, turned my attention to the officers. Team leader. I said, my voice tight with a fury I was struggling to contain. I want your name and badge number, and I want to know who authorized this level of response for a child flying a toy in his own yard. The officer, a captain named Miller, looked uncomfortable. Sir, we acted on the information provided. The nature of the call indicated a potential high-risk situation. The nature of the call was a lie. Captain, I stated, my gaze unwavering. A malicious, racially motivated lie. And I intend to find out exactly what was said and by whom. My eyes flicked meaningfully towards Karen Mitchell, who had the decency to look momentarily flustered, though her husband quickly ushered her back inside their house. The first stage of the rising action began in the immediate aftermath. The SWAT team departed, leaving behind a trampled lawn. Terrified children, David and Maya had witnessed the whole thing from their bedroom window, and a neighborhood buzzing with hushed, anxious whispers. Jamal was inconsolable. He couldn't stop shaking. He kept repeating, I didn't do anything, Uncle Marcus. I was just flying it. Why did they think I was a terrorist? How do you explain to a child that the color of his skin, combined with someone's baseless fear and malice, could turn him into a perceived threat in an instant? My confrontation with Karen later that day was inevitable. I walked over to her house, my anger a cold, hard knot in my stomach. She opened the door, her expression one of feigned concern that quickly hardened into defiance when she saw my face. Marcus I'm glad everyone's okay. She began, her voice dripping with insincerity. It was such a scare. Save it, Karen. I cut her off, my voice dangerously quiet. You called SWAT on my 16-year-old nephew for flying a toy drone. You told them he was a terrorist. Do you have any idea what could have happened to him? She drew herself up, her chin jutting out. I saw what I saw, Marcus. He was acting suspiciously. That drone was flying very close to my house, looking in my windows. And in this day and age, you can't be too careful. It's my duty as a citizen, as a member of this HOA, to report suspicious activity. Suspicious activity, I repeated, incredulous. He was in his own backyard, Karen. Your house is a good 50 yards away, and there are trees obscuring the view. He wasn't looking in your windows. And what exactly about Jamal, a black teenager, translates to terrorist in your mind? Her eyes narrowed. Now you're playing the race card. This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with safety and security. That boy, he looked out of place. And that device. It's not just a toy. It's a sophisticated piece of equipment. For all I knew, it could have been carrying explosives. The sheer, unadulterated prejudice in her words, the calm assertion of her twisted reality was staggering. She wasn't just mistaken. She was doubling down, convinced of her own righteousness. She truly believed, or wanted to believe, that Jamal was a threat, and his race was an undeniable, if unspoken, factor in that assessment. You are lying, Karen, I said, my voice flat. And you know you are. You deliberately escalated the situation. You endangered a child's life, and I promise you there will be consequences for this. Her composure wavered for a moment. Are you threatening me, Marcus? Because I have rights, and the HOA will stand by me. We have rules about drones, you know, and about disturbances. This isn't about an HOA rule, Karen, I retorted. This is about a false emergency report. This is about racial profiling. And yes, I am telling you, there will be consequences. You may be unaware, Karen, but my position as director of city surveillance gives me a certain understanding of how these systems work and how they can be abused. A flicker of unease crossed her face, then a brief moment of calculation. But it was quickly gone, replaced by her usual mask of indignant self-importance. Well, we'll see about that, she sniffed and closed the door in my face. The battle lines were drawn. Karen wasn't going to back down. She was going to fight to justify her actions, to paint herself as the victim, and Jamal as the villain. And she would undoubtedly try to use the HOA as her weapon. The next few weeks were a grueling ordeal. Jamal was deeply affected. He barely spoke, refused to leave the house, and suffered from nightmares. The drone lay in its box, untouched. Sarah and I did our best to support him, to reassure him, but the trauma of having a dozen automatic weapons pointed at him was not easily erased. We arranged for him to speak with a therapist. My attempt to file a formal complaint against Karen for filing a false police report hit an immediate snag, marking the second shocking incident in this escalating drama. I met with an internal affairs sergeant at the precinct that had dispatched the SWAT team. Sergeant Davies was polite but dismissive. Mr. Thorne, I understand you're upset, he said, steepling his fingers, and it's unfortunate your nephew was frightened. But from our perspective, the officers followed protocol based on the information received. Ms. Mitchell is a known member of the community, a regular neighborhood watch participant. She reported a potential threat. We have to take such reports seriously. Even when they are demonstrably false and racially motivated, I pressed. Did you listen to the 911 call, Sergeant? Did you review the facts? My nephew was flying a toy drone on his own property in broad daylight. Davies shifted uncomfortably. The call mentioned suspicious behavior, possible casing. The term terrorist device was used. We can't ignore that. SWAT deployment is based on the perceived level of threat. Perhaps Ms. Mitchell overreacted, but it's better to err on the side of caution. On the side of caution. I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it calm. Captain, that caution almost got my nephew killed. Are you telling me that there will be no investigation into Karen Mitchell's false report? He sighed. We can make a note of your concerns, Mr. Thorne. But frankly, unless you have concrete evidence of malicious intent beyond her statement, it's her word against, well, the circumstances. People make mistakes. They get scared. It was a classic institutional brush-off. protect their own, minimize liability, dismiss the victim's experience. The implication was clear: Karen, a white woman, a concerned citizen, was inherently more credible than a black teenager and his angry uncle, even if that uncle was a city director. Karen, meanwhile, emboldened by the lack of immediate police action against her, launched her own offensive. She started a smear campaign on the Oak Haven neighborhood online forum. Under anonymous usernames and through carefully worded posts from her own account, she wove a narrative of a growing problem with unsupervised youths and disregard for community safety. She hinted at outsiders bringing trouble into the neighborhood. She posted out-of-context photos of Jamal from a distance, making him look shadowy and furtive. She even fabricated an account of Jamal's drone diving at her dog and spying on her granddaughter through her bedroom window. Lies, all of them, but crafted to sow fear and suspicion. She also mobilized her allies within the HOA. An emergency meeting was called ostensibly to discuss drone safety regulations, but it was clearly orchestrated by Karen to target Jamal and our family. She proposed an outright ban on all drone activity within Oak Haven, citing Jamal's reckless behavior as the prime example. She painted herself as a community hero who had bravely confronted a potential threat, while subtly portraying me as someone abusing my city position to intimidate her and cover up my nephew's supposed misdeeds. The stress was immense. Not only was I dealing with Jamal's trauma and Karen's relentless attacks, but I was also facing a system that seemed designed to protect people like her, not people like us. The professional in me, the city surveillance director who believed in order and justice, was clashing with the furious, protective uncle and father. But this clash wasn't a weakness. It was becoming my strength. Karen thought she was dealing with just another angry resident. She had no idea of the resources I could and would ethically marshal. The first layer of the midpoint twist began to unravel as I decided to use my professional knowledge, not my positional power, to dig deeper into Karen Mitchell. As city surveillance director, I had a deep understanding of data systems, public records, and the digital footprints people leave. I couldn't arbitrarily access restricted information, nor would I ever abuse my position in that way. But I knew what was publicly available, what could be requested through official channels, and how to connect disparate pieces of information. I started with a formal Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request for all 911 call logs originating from Karen Mitchell's address over the past 5 years, as well as any associated incident reports. I also cross-referenced this with publicly available HOA meeting minutes and online neighborhood forum archives. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Karen Mitchell had made dozens of calls to 911. Many were trivial noise complaints about children playing parking violations that were often non-existent suspicious persons who turned out to be delivery drivers or new neighbors who didn't fit her demographic ideal. A significant number of her suspicious person calls disproportionately targeted people of color. A Latino gardening crew, a black teenager selling magazines door-to-door, an Asian family having a large gathering. Each time she had used inflammatory language, exaggerating the perceived threat. Furthermore, I discovered that Karen had a close personal relationship with a senior dispatcher, a woman named Brenda Sykes, and often asked to speak with her directly. Their call logs sometimes indicated prolonged conversations before an official dispatch was even made. This suggested a level of familiarity and potential collusion that went beyond a typical citizen-dispatcher interaction. Was Brenda coaching Karen, or was Karen manipulating Brenda? The HOA records also showed Karen consistently leveraging these police reports, even the ones that resulted in no action to support her arguments for stricter rules, increased security measures, often pointedly directed at common areas frequented by younger residents or newer families, and to marginalize anyone who challenged her authority. She had successfully driven out at least one young family renters she had deemed undesirable through a relentless campaign of HOA complaints and police calls. This wasn't just about one incident with Jamal. This was a sustained pattern of behavior, a weaponization of emergency services and community regulations fueled by prejudice and a desire for control. The second layer of the twist, the smoking gun, came from an unexpected source. A young police officer, one of the first responders on the scene before the SWAT team arrived, had been deeply troubled by the incident. His body cam footage, which I obtained through another formal request as part of my complaint regarding the police response itself, was illuminating. It captured Karen moments after her 911 call speaking to this first officer. She was agitated, yes, but also clearly embellishing her story, her eyes darting towards Jamal with undisguised animosity. But the real breakthrough came when this officer, let's call him Officer Ramirez, reached out to me discreetly through a mutual acquaintance in the police union, someone who knew of my work on police oversight committees. Ramirez was young, idealistic, and genuinely disturbed by what he perceived as a gross misuse of police resources and blatant racial profiling orchestrated by a civilian. He had reviewed the full unredacted audio of Karen's 911 call as part of the initial incident report he had to file. He couldn't officially share it with me without becoming a whistleblower, a career-ending move he wasn't prepared for, but he could and did describe its contents in detail. He confirmed that Karen had explicitly and repeatedly emphasized Jamal's race. She had used phrases like, "He looks like one of those thugs and these people are all the same." She had insisted that the drone was definitely not a toy, and that she knew what these types are capable of. She had even suggested he might be connected to recent burglaries in a neighboring town, a completely unfounded and inflammatory accusation. When the initial dispatcher had sounded hesitant about the terrorist device, claimed Karen had become more agitated, demanding a supervisor, at which point she was likely connected to her friend Brenda Sykes, who then escalated it. Ramirez's account painted a damning picture of Karen's calculated, racially charged manipulation of the 911 system. He also noted that the initial responding officers had been inclined to dismiss it as a minor issue until Karen, upon their arrival, became hysterical about the imminent danger, likely prompting them to call for SWAT backup based on her escalating claims rather than their own on-scene assessment. This was the critical piece. It wasn't just Karen's perception. It was her deliberate, malicious construction of a narrative designed to provoke extreme fear and a disproportionate response, all founded on racial animus. Officer Ramirez, though unable to testify directly without jeopardizing his career, agreed to provide an anonymous written statement detailing what he had heard on the call and witnessed on the scene, which, while not as strong as a direct recording, would still carry weight, especially coming from within the department. He also pointed me towards specific departmental policies on handling potentially biased civilian reports, which he felt had been ignored. Armed with this new information, Karen's history of calls, her connection with the dispatcher, the detailed account of her racist 911 call, and the body cam footage inconsistencies, my strategy for the climax crystallized. This wouldn't just be about clearing Jamal's name or seeking damages. This would be about exposing a systemic vulnerability and holding Karen Mitchell accountable in a very public way. I requested to speak at the upcoming City Council Public Safety Committee meeting. My official capacity as Director of City Surveillance gave me standing, but I made it clear I was also speaking as a concerned citizen and the guardian of a minor who had been wrongfully targeted. I ensured that Captain Miller Sergeant Davies, and through a formal city request dispatcher, Brenda Sykes, were asked to be present to answer questions regarding the incident and departmental protocols. I also invited members of the Oakhaven HOA board, and pointedly Karen Mitchell herself. She couldn't be compelled to attend as a private citizen, but her absence would be noted. To my surprise, she confirmed she would be there, likely assuming she could control the narrative. The council chamber was packed. News of the Oakhaven SWAT incident had begun to leak to local media, framed initially as a terrorism scare, averted, but whispers of racial profiling were starting to surface. My presentation was meticulously prepared. I began by calmly recounting the events of that Saturday, showing benign photos of Jamal and his toy drone. Then I contrasted it with anonymized, to protect officers' identities, initially snippets of body cam footage showing the terrifying reality of the SWAT response. The mood in the room shifted palpably. Next, I presented the data on Karen Mitchell's history of 911 calls, highlighting the disproportionate targeting of minorities and her pattern of escalating language. I spoke about the documented interaction between her and dispatcher Brenda Sykes. Sykes, seated in the front row with other city employees, visibly paled. Then, referencing Officer Ramirez's anonymized but detailed statement, I recounted the explicitly racist and manipulative language Karen had used in her 911 call to ensure a heightened response against Jamal. She did not merely report a drone council members, I stated, my voice ringing with controlled anger. She reported a black thug with a terrorist device. She manufactured a threat based on the color of my nephew's skin. Karen, from her seat in the public gallery, jumped to her feet. That's a lie. I never said those things. He's twisting my words. I was scared. The committee chair banged his gavel. "Ms. Mitchell, you will have a chance to speak later if you wish, but you are out of order." I continued. This was not a mistake. This was not a citizen erring on the side of caution. This was a deliberate act of filing a false, racially motivated emergency report, an act that endangered a child, traumatized a family, and wasted significant city resources. It also highlights a critical vulnerability in our emergency response system, its susceptibility to manipulation by individuals willing to exploit societal biases for their own ends. I then turned to the broader implications, discussing the need for better training for dispatchers and officers in recognizing and de-escalating situations involving potential bias, and for stricter penalties for those who maliciously misuse the 911 system. I proposed specific policy recommendations, drawing on my expertise as surveillance director regarding the verification of high threat calls and the importance of objective threat indicators over subjective, potentially biased civilian claims. When it was time for questions, the council members grilled Captain Miller and Sergeant Davies about their department's handling of the call and the subsequent complaint. They were defensive, but the evidence I had presented made their standard explanations sound weak and insufficient. Dispatcher Brenda Sykes, when questioned about her relationship with Karen and her handling of the call, stammered through denials and memory lapses, her credibility crumbling under scrutiny. Finally, Jamal, who had insisted on being there, was given the opportunity to speak. He stood at the podium, his voice trembling slightly, but his words clear and powerful. He didn't speak of anger or revenge. He spoke of his fear, his confusion, and his dashed hopes for a peaceful summer. He spoke of how it felt to be judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin and the fear in someone else's eyes. "I just want to know why," he concluded, his young voice echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. "Why did she hate me so much without even knowing me?" Karen Mitchell, when offered the chance to respond, was a shadow of her former self. Her bluster was gone, replaced by a stammering, incoherent defense that only served to incriminate her further. The public exposure, the weight of the evidence, and Jamal's quiet dignity had shattered her facade. The falling action began almost immediately. The City Council ordered a full independent investigation into the Oak Haven incident, as well as a review of 911 dispatch protocols and bias training for the police department. Dispatcher Brenda Sykes was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Captain Miller and Sergeant Davies faced internal reviews. For Karen Mitchell, the consequences were more severe. Based on the evidence presented and further investigation spurred by the public outcry, the district attorney's office moved forward with charges, multiple counts of filing false police reports, misuse of the 911 emergency system, and significantly, they were exploring hate crime enhancements due to the clear evidence of racial animus. Her arrest was quiet, but made local news. The HOA, facing potential lawsuits and intense public pressure, quickly moved to remove Karen from all committee positions and began proceedings to censure her, distancing themselves as much as possible. Her social standing in the neighborhood evaporated overnight. Neighbors who had once tolerated or even supported her now shunned her. Her reign of terror was definitively over. The resolution was not swift, as legal processes rarely are, but it was steady and just. Karen Mitchell eventually pleaded guilty to several charges to avoid a more prolonged and damaging trial. She received a hefty fine, a period of probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and extensive community service, part of which was to be served in organizations promoting racial understanding. The hate crime enhancement didn't stick due to the high bar of legal proof required for intent, but the judge's sentencing remarks left no doubt about the racial motivations behind her actions. The city implemented many of the policy changes I'd advocated for, including enhanced dispatcher training on identifying biased reports and new protocols for verifying information before deploying high-level tactical responses. Officer Ramirez, who had taken a considerable risk, was quietly commended internally for his integrity after the independent review validated his concerns, and he became an advocate for reform within his precinct. For Jamal, the healing was a journey. The therapy helped, as did the outpouring of support from our family friends, and even strangers who had heard his story. He eventually started flying his drone again, first in our backyard, then cautiously in the local park. He even started a small drone club at his high school, back home, teaching younger kids about the technology, and just as importantly, about responsible use. The experience had scarred him, but it hadn't broken his spirit. If anything, it had given him a new perspective, a deeper understanding of the world, and a quiet determination to be a force for good. Our family, and indeed our neighborhood, changed. The incident forced uncomfortable but necessary conversations about race prejudice and community responsibility. The Oak Haven HOA, under new leadership, actively worked to become more inclusive. They organized community dialogues and invited speakers on diversity and unconscious bias. The street where red dots once danced on my nephew's chest became a place where children of all backgrounds played a little more freely their laughter, a testament to the resilience of community and the enduring power of justice. My role as city surveillance director took on a new dimension. I'd always been committed to the ethical use of technology for public safety, but now that commitment was infused with a deeply personal understanding of how easily systems could be perverted by human bias and how vital it was to build safeguards not just into our technology, but into our institutions and our hearts. The fight had been harrowing, the stakes unbearably high, but in the end, the truth had prevailed, not just for Jamal, but for all those who had ever been judged, feared, or targeted simply because of who they were. And that, I knew, was a victory worth every agonizing moment.